Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I will start by please sharing my screen. Can you see my screen, everyone?
Yes, good. All good.
Good. Right. So thank you very much for attending this session today. I'm sure that you will enjoy this week's program because there are fantastic sessions coming up the rest of the week. So let's have a look at assessment for learning. Now, I guess that you are all familiar with this situation that I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, this is a teacher teaching her class, right? And there's a group of students listening to the teacher. She's explaining the lesson, and then she thinks, oops, sorry. Okay, I'm teaching this lesson, but are my students learning? And this is a big question for us. Is our teaching leading to learning? And we obviously have a tool to help us answer this question, and the tool is assessment. Now, anytime we assess students, we either assess in a summative or in a formative way. And it's a little bit more than a question of prepositions. Now, assessment of learning is summative, as I said, and it usually happens at the end of a period of teaching, right? It could be the end of a unit of work, the end of an academic year, the end of the lesson. And the aim is to determine whether the students have mastered the content or not. Now, assessment for learning or formative assessment is not summative because the purpose is not to determine who has succeeded and who did not, but to provide guidance to the student through specific feedback and also descriptive feedback. And having a clear understanding of this particular process is important because there are many things that are given the title of formative assessment, but they don't really meet the definition that evidence of student success supports. So let's have a look. According to Dylan William, formative assessment is something that functions, is a type of assessment that functions formatively to the extent that evidence about student achievement is elicited, interpreted, and used by teachers, learners, or their peers to make decisions about the next steps in instruction that are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have made in the absence of that evidence. Now, the first point about this definition is the use of the term formatively, formative, to describe the function that evidence from the assessment usually serves. As a result, any assessment can thus be formative. That depends on the function of the data it elicits. Now, the second point to consider here is who is doing the assessment. Traditionally, it was just the teacher, but William includes learners and peers as agents in making the decisions. The third point is the focus on the decisions and not on intentions of those involved, of the agents involved in the assessment. The next point aligns with this third one in that the focus is on the resulting action instead of on intentions. And the definition also focuses on decisions about the next steps in instruction, which refers to a combination of teaching and learning, or to any activity that intends to create learning. So formative and summative are not labels for different types or forms of assessment. They describe how assessments are used. For example, a task, an activity is not formative unless the information it provides is actually used to progress learning, to help students develop better learning. So when we use formative assessment, what we do is identify the present status of a student in terms of the learning intentions, of the learning standards. We diagnose how to assist them, we provide feedback, and we allow the student to make changes and celebrate success. So, assessment for learning helps students to, first, understand the reason and the focus of their learning. Ask important questions to support their learning and construct meaning. Then they can use the feedback to plan the next steps in learning and select or adjust the strategies they need in order to make improvements and achieve their goals. It also helps students recognize success in learning, identify goals and work towards those goals, make connections among ideas to extend learning, and invest more fully in their own learning. Now, a key resource created by the Assessment for Learning Reform Group is the 10 principles of assessment for learning. According to the Assessment for Learning Reform Group, this assessment for learning should be an integral part of teachers' effective planning. That is, a teacher's planning should provide opportunities for both learners and teachers to obtain and use information about progress towards learning goals. And it also has to be flexible to respond to initial and emerging ideas and skills. It should also focus on how students learn. The process of learning has to be in the minds of both learners and teachers when the assessment is planned and when the evidence is interpreted. So learners should also be aware of the how of their learning as they are of the what they are learning. It should also be a central feature of classroom practice. Now, much of what we do in the classroom and much of what the students do in the classroom can be classified as assessment, can be described as assessment. That is, tasks and questions prompt learners to demonstrate their learning, their understanding, and their skills. So it should be central to classroom practice. Also, it should be a key professional skill for all teachers. And this is something that I have noticed lacking in many teacher training programs. I am originally from Argentina, and I remember in teacher training programs back there, when I was living there, did not focus on assessment or assessment for learning. The focus was more on summative assessment. I have been now based in Spain for 20 years, and I also notice this lack. Fortunately, there is an increased interest in learning more about formative assessment in the last few years, but it should be a key professional skill for all of us. It should also be seen as a sensitive and constructive process. We should be aware of the impact that comments, grades, marks can have on students' confidence. And the feedback should be as constructive as possible. Also, never underestimate the importance of student motivation. Assessment that encourages learning fosters motivation by emphasizing progress and achievement. So we need to foster that. And of course, we should avoid comparing students at all costs. Also, assessment for learning should promote understanding of goals and criteria. That is, we should encourage a shared understanding of the criteria by which learning goals are assessed. For effective learning to take place, learners need to understand what it is that they are trying to achieve and want to achieve it. So communicating assessment criteria involves discussing these criteria with learners, using language that they can understand and also providing examples of how the criteria can be met in practice. Also, we need to ensure that learners receive constructive guidance on how to improve their learning. It's not enough with saying, okay, you are here, you got this grade, or you are doing well. We need to give guidance. We also need to develop students' self-capacity for self-assessment. Teachers should pinpoint the learner's strengths and advise on how to develop them, be clear and constructive about weaknesses and how they might be addressed, and also provide opportunities for learners to improve their work. And finally, assessment should recognize the full range of educational achievement. That is, we should equip learners with the desire and the capacity to take charge of their learning. And we should be doing this through developing the skills of self-assessment, because this is not just an academic skill, it is a lifelong skill. So these principles are very useful, at least in my opinion, as they clearly show how assessment for learning fits into our teaching practice, be it in the planning, the learning criteria, or guiding learning. It emphasizes learning rather than grading. Students don't receive a grade, they receive feedback that helps them to improve. Therefore, what makes an assessment formative is what we do with the information that the assessment generates. And assessment only qualifies as assessment for learning if we, teachers, gather, interpret, and use the data about student performance for the purpose of teaching differently and more effectively. Now, let's see how all this fits into the classroom. Let's see. So, as we have seen, assessment for learning focuses both on the teacher and on the student. And it focuses on them understanding three key elements: where the learner is going, that is, sharing the aims of a lesson and success criteria helps students to see what they are aiming for and what they need to do to achieve those aims. And this is something that I have noticed. I mean, as a writer of teachers' resource books, I always include learning intentions and success criteria in the teacher's notes. And in the student's book, we generally have learning intentions and success criteria, but we don't use it. We don't use this resource. We need to share this with the students. Now, second stage, where the learner is now. So techniques such as effective questioning will help teachers gauge what individual students and groups have learned during a lesson or a period of learning. This will generate evidence of learning that we can use, and I mean we teachers and the students can use in order to assess their work. And then how can the learner get there? That is, teachers use this evidence of learning to inform choices about what they will do next with the class or with individual students. And learners can use this evidence to make decisions about their own learning. Now, what are the elements of assessment for learning? There are some key elements in assessment for learning. The main components are, as I have mentioned before, learning intentions and success criteria. Learning intentions inform pupils about what they are going to learn and why. And the success criteria tell them how to recognize that they have achieved the learning intentions. So, pupils and teachers can negotiate the learning intentions and the success criteria before the lesson begins. And we need to remember that it will be only these items that the pupils will be measured against. Then we have peer and self-assessment and self-evaluation that considers not only what the pupils have learned, but also how they learn best. Formative feedback provides pupils with information on the successful areas of their learning, and also information about improvements to be made. And this feedback should be based on the learning intentions and the success criteria. And finally, effective questioning. That is, asking questions in such a way that they provide you with key information that you can use to determine where the learning currently is, expand the learning, and plan for future learning. And it's also about encouraging more pupil questioning, something that we don't usually do. It's usually us asking the questions rather than the students. Now, let's focus on some of these elements in more depth. And I'm going to begin with learning intentions and success criteria. So, learning intentions, learning aims, learning objectives, they describe what pupils should know, understand, or be able to do by the end of the lesson, a series of lessons, a unit, etc. As I say, we don't generally share these with the students, and we should. So in assessment for learning, the word intention is used intentionally, deliberately, because it puts greater emphasis on the process of learning rather than on the end product. So, as I said, a learning intention is simply a description of what you want the students to know, understand, or be able to do. And then we have the success criteria, how to recognize success. That is, the learning intentions spell out what the pupils will learn and why, and the success criteria show them how to recognize success or the extent of their success. Why are these important? Students, it has been shown by research that when we share learning intentions and success criteria with the students and we keep them informed about how they will be assessed, it empowers the students because it involves them in their own performance and learning. And as I say, although we have them in the books, for example, or in the teachers' books, we rarely use them, and I encourage you to use them. So to give our students the tools they need to take more responsibility for their own learning, we need to tell them 3 things: what they are going to learn, why they should learn it in the first place, and how they will recognize when they have succeeded. And this is very motivational for the students. It helps students become more focused for longer periods of time, more motivated, and also it helps them become more able to take responsibility for their own learning. Now, when we are working with assessment, we have peer and self-assessment. Now, the 4 steps of assessment for learning include teacher assessment and feedback, peer assessment and feedback, student self-assessment and feedback, and finally, hopefully this will result in an autonomous, self-reflective, analytical learner. Now, peer and self-assessment are effective approaches to enhance the learning of the students. Explicitly teaching students how to assess their own work and the work of their peers has many benefits because it promotes students' understanding of their learning and provides opportunities for critical analysis of their own efforts, encouraging them to become more autonomous. Peer assessment also allows learners to reflect critically upon the learning of their peers. And this makes this peer assessment a reciprocal process because the student providing feedback also benefits from increasing their own understanding by having to review someone else's work. And as a result, they can reflect on their own understanding or performance in a task. They will see, okay, I did this task in this particular way, but this guy has done it in this other way. he did it very well, and this is a bit different from what I have done. So they start thinking about how to improve their own practices, let's say, their own strategies. It allows students to develop a broader view of how questions can be answered, how tasks can be completed, and what methods their peers are using. And all this occurs best because it is not magic. This occurs best when students are accustomed to and comfortable with a cycle of assessment, feedback, action, using learning intentions and success criteria, and receiving and applying improvement feedback from teachers. It takes time and it takes practice, so it's necessary to explicitly teach and model how to provide feedback before handing this to the students. Self-assessment gives students the opportunity to use success criteria to make judgments about their own work, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and set targets. And it helps them to better understand what their work is being judged against, what good work should include or look like, and how to go about making it better. Now, when we explicitly teach students to become effective self-assessors, they become more empowered to take charge of their own learning. And this, I insist on this, is a necessary skill for lifelong learning. As with peer assessment, this takes time and practice, and we need to explicitly teach and model how to self-assess before students can use it effectively and independently. Now, how can we introduce peer self-assessment in our lessons? First of all, identifying those assignments or activities for which students might benefit from peer self-assessment and feedback. I mean, we don't need to introduce peer self-assessment and feedback in every single lesson and in every single activity. We need, when we are planning our lessons, we need to identify those moments in the lesson, those activities or assignments that are useful for peer and self-assessment and feedback. Also, break large assignments into smaller chunks and incorporate peer assessment opportunities and self-assessment opportunities at each stage. For example, when they are outlining the assignment, when they are doing a first draft, when they are brainstorming ideas, if they are planning, for example, in a group project or group writing, if they are planning a presentation or a piece of writing. So they will be experimenting also small wins along the way. Involve the students in clarifying and defining the success criteria so that they know what the learning looks like and they will understand what is expected of them. Also, we work with exemplars, with samples, examples that make the criteria visible for the students and invite them to spot those strengths and weaknesses in the exemplars that they use. This is very simple. I mean, you can take work from previous years or other classes, anonymous work, obviously, and ask the students to apply the success criteria, the learning intentions and success criteria in the work they are examining. Teach them how to apply this. Explicit instruction and modeling helps them understand what constitutes quality work. Provide guidance as they apply the criteria, yes, by using this anonymous work, for example. Also, support them with prompts, with sentence starters, with forms, because normally what we do is, and I've done this myself a lot of times, okay, sit together with a partner, exchange your work and give each other feedback. Okay, and the feedback we get is, it's nice, and maybe it's interesting, I like it. That's not useful. But if we don't teach the students how to assess what to look for and how to give feedback, obviously we will get the "it's nice" comment. So helping them with prompts and sentence starters and forms is provides support and is useful to get them learning how to assess and give feedback. Now, how can we support peer assessment? First of all, by combining it with our own feedback. We cannot expect students to just give feedback from the very beginning. As I mentioned before, we need to teach them, we need to model. Develop and use peer assessment tools, checklists, templates, rubrics. Use the gradual release of responsibility model, that is, teacher modeling, guided instruction, shared practice, and then independent practice. Also, develop ground rules for giving effective feedback to be used by the students when they give and they receive the feedback. Remind them of the success criteria and emphasize that all feedback and all comments must relate to that success criterion that they have seen. And insist and require evidence that peer assessment, feedback, and improvements have been made, have occurred before they request your assistance. Now, how can we support self-assessment? As with peer assessment, making it a regular part of the lesson, not something that happens sometimes, yes, during a lesson. Ensuring that they understand, that students understand that self-assessment is about learning and improvement, not about being right or wrong, or asking them to do your job, which is something that sometimes they think, okay, she's asking me to do her job. She should be assessing me, not me. Explicitly teaching, modeling, and scaffolding self-assessment, just like with peer assessment. And again, using a range of techniques and tools to enable students to gradually take responsibility for their own learning and progress. Also, asking students to highlight the best section of their work. And in this way, they will be able to identify where they have met each of the success criteria. Including some reflection time at the end of the lesson. And this applies also to group work. Yes, that is devoting 5 minutes. You don't need to devote much more than 5 minutes at the end of every lesson for students to do something that reflects their perception of their performance in the lesson, using exit tickets, exit cards, where students write and submit answers to prompts. For example, what was the most important thing you learned today? What questions do you still have? Which part of today's work are you proudest of? This encourages reflection, yes, and also helps them assess their own work. Now, let's examine another element of assessment for learning, and that is formative feedback. That is, feedback is only useful if students' learning improves. And this depends on their capacity to understand the feedback and have an inclination to accept it and act upon it. This has got an interpersonal, motivational element that is very, very important. And the goal is to change the students' capacity to produce better work, not just to improve their present work. So, formative feedback. We can give formative feedback about the task, that is how well they are performing, about the processing of a task, that is focusing on the processes that a student uses to complete a task, and also about self-regulation. That is, learners need to learn to assess their own knowledge, ability, cognitive strategies, and achievement. And this is part of helping them develop metacognitive strategies. Students who are more successful are more successful because they use metacognitive strategies in an efficient way, much more than those students who are not as successful. And this is something that has been researched. I have done research on this with my own students for some time. So self-regulation is a very important skill, and also helping students to think about their learning, to think about how they learn, what they do to learn, and what strategies they use to complete tasks and to learn things. So formative feedback focuses on what is said to the students and how it is said, so that they will understand what you said, emotionally accept what is being said, be willing to make a change, and actually implement the change. Because feedback is only successful if the student learning improves. And this depends on their capacity to understand the feedback and the inclination to accept and act upon this feedback. Now, there are some criteria that we need to bear in mind when we're talking about feedback. Feedback has to be timely. The sooner it is given, the better. That is, if you wait for a week or 10 days after a piece of work has been done to give feedback, that feedback is not useful. The moment is lost, and the student might not connect the feedback with the action. It should be educative in nature. That is, providing feedback means giving students an explanation of what they are doing correctly and incorrectly. However, the focus of the feedback should be based essentially on what the students have done right. It's not a got you. Okay, I caught you putting your foot in it. No, it's most productive when students are provided with an explanation and an example as to what is accurate and inaccurate about their work. And you can consider using the feedback sandwich to give your feedback. That is, compliment, correct, compliment. Excuse me. That is, first give positive feedback, a positive comment. Then constructive feedback on what needs to be improved. And finally, a closing statement reaffirming the constructive feedback. It should also be specific. That is, students need to understand what they have done well and what they need to improve or change and focus on next. When feedback is superficial or generic, students are not able to decide what to do next. It should be understandable, that is, in student-friendly language, actionable, because feedback must provide opportunities to act upon the information provided. It should be sensitive to the individual needs of the students. Our students are different. They are diverse. Some just need to be nudged a bit to achieve their aims. Others need to be handled sensitively, not to damage their self-esteem. So a balance between giving feedback and not hurting is essential. And it should be aligned to the learning intentions and success criteria, of course. Now, for example, here we have some examples of feedback, feedback statements or prompts. Now, if you look at these, there are some that are useful, there are some that are not that useful, and there are some that are totally useless. Now, for example, A, this is a very positive comment and gives praise for a pupil's work, but it doesn't highlight exactly what the student did well, so it's not useful. Then we have B and E, for example. They are quality formative feedback because the student is receiving guidance on how to improve. Whereas C and D do not give sufficient direction to the student on how to improve their work. You must try harder. Teacher, I try, but I can never do it. So we need to be very specific So, some tips. When we are giving feedback, base the feedback on the learning goal and avoid comparing students. Focus only on only 2 or 3 critical feedback points, because otherwise students will do the hippo thing. When hippos go underwater, they close their ears and nostrils so that water doesn't get into their heads. Okay, students will do the same. If you give them more than 2 or 3 pieces of feedback at a time, they will do the hippo thing and not listen to you. Provide concrete suggestions for improvement. We have seen the prompts, yes? Communicate directly the strength or the gap and suggest small, manageable change. Large, complex changes are overwhelming, and give constant feedback and timely feedback. So what tools can we use? As I mentioned, exemplars or samples of good work, checklists. Checklists are really useful because you can brainstorm the checklist with the students, and then they use that to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of their work. Also, the mini fishbowl feedback. When you're having pair work, appoint a third student who can, with a checklist, sit in and listen, for example, to the other 2 students interacting. And in this way, they can make notes and give positive, that is, useful feedback. And the tag feedback. Tell something that you like. Ask a question. For example, what's missing that you want to know? What is unclear that you need help understanding? And give a suggestion for improvement. And then we have effective questioning. Many a time, what we do is most of our time is devoted to asking questions, and asking questions about yes, no questions or management questions. Let's think and plan the questions that we want to ask so that they engage students in thinking, higher order thinking, so that they can use these questions to analyze their own thinking and their own work. There are different types of questions. You have closed questions, for example, and yes, no questions. Yes, no questions do have a place if they are followed by closed questions that help students reflect and think. Now, quick tip. When you are planning your lessons, plan the questions that you're going to ask. Your goal should be to determine what level of questions you will ask. Select the content for questioning. Choose the material which you consider important. Ask questions that require extended responses or at least content answers. Write your main questions in advance and arrange them in some logical sequence. And maybe some follow-up questions. But remember that they are not written on stone. You can change them later. Think of additional questions to follow up. Phrase your questions in such a way that the task is clear. Avoid implied response questions. Sometimes we ask questions that contain the answers, and anticipate possible students' responses so that you can plan follow-up questions. Now, there are many more things that we can go deeper into, but I think that we need to have some time for your questions. So it's, tell me, Paul, if we are okay with the time now?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely, perfect, spot on.
Good. So if I may, here, if after this session, you need to ask more questions, of course, you can contact British Council. You can find me all over the place. I'm on social media. You can send me a message. There you have my contacts. So please feel free to contact me anytime, next week, tomorrow, next year, when you wish. And thank you very much. And thank you, British Council, for inviting me to open this wonderful week of assessment.
Thanks, Annie. That was great. Really, really interesting, and lots in there, and lots of comments as well. I'm very personally particularly pleased you mentioned self-regulated learning, because I spent quite a long time studying that and looking at that and seeing how that's evolved. It's quite interesting, actually. It sort of seems to have evolved sort of in the context of more of collaborative learning, which kind of reflects, I think, what you're talking about, the peer assessment. I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but in terms of where we are now, where there is a lot more emphasis on collaboration, do you
I
see?
think so, yes. Yeah, yes. That is, for example, when we attended IATEFL last month, there were lots of sessions on collaboration, collaborative learning. I'm just back from the API conference in Portugal, and there were also many sessions on collaborative learning. And I think that's the way to go, definitely.
Okay, great. Okay, let's have a look at some questions, because there's quite a few. Some of them, I've been having a look, some of them are quite similar, and I think you kind of answered a lot of them actually around, particularly around how we can promote self-assessment in class, how we can persuade students that, you know, it's a good thing. And I think, I mean, one of the slides you sort of showed quite a few sort of strategies and ideas.
Yes, because sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
Because many a time, of course, not with younger students, but with teenagers and older students, they may get this impression that they are doing our job. So what I found important is to directly talk to them about our approach and explain in very clear and simple language what we plan to do, why we are doing what we are doing. And sometimes we will need also to explain this to parents. Because sometimes, well, maybe when the kids go home and they tell their parents what they have been doing, parents, particularly parents who are teachers, we are the worst kind of parent. Sometimes they will say, oh, but why doesn't she do it herself? Or why doesn't he do it himself? So it's important to make our procedure clear to the students and to the parents sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about that, particularly in terms of where, I suppose, in mainstream education contexts where, you know, there is an exam at the end. The sort of challenge there between kind of this kind of assessment and I suppose what parents expect based on the fact that their son or their daughter or their child is going to be taking an exam at the end of the year. They need to, you know, for them it's very tangible, that kind of, okay, you got good marks, okay, you got good marks.
That's right.
So it's interesting, that kind of discussion, as you say, it kind of needs to be a discussion that's sort of had with parents and with learners themselves as well, so that they, you know, they can see the benefit of that. There were a couple of questions, one from Facebook and one in here as well, around different kind of contexts. I just wondered whether you had any experience of this in terms of assessment for learning, where you have perhaps classes where there are students with specific educational needs.
Well, I must say that that's not my area of expertise, because I mean, with regard to students with special educational needs, I'm a learner too there. It's such a different context. It can be done, but of course we need to have specialized knowledge there. And I'm afraid that with special educational needs, that's not my strongest point.
Okay.
I can mention other professionals, other colleagues who are experts in the area. And Margaret Smith, for example.
Okay.
She's an expert in the area. However, there are teachers, for example, who usually work with students with special educational needs. They can also adapt these techniques and these strategies to these students. They can
Okay.
be used.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. You know, it's just a question from Hiba Shaheen in
Yes.
Facebook. Also from Facebook from Hiram, and we'll get to some of the questions in Zoom just a second. I mean, for me, it seems that assessment for learning and the processes that you talked about lend themselves very well to large classes where you maybe have 30, 40, 50 students in the
Yes.
class. Is that your kind of thinking as
Yes.
well?
Yes, because, for example, in Argentina, particularly in public schools, we usually have large groups, 30, 40 students in a class, which is far from ideal, of course. But you can do this all the same, because if you start, that is, if you begin working in pairs and then in small groups, and with students working in small groups, they can do assessment for learning. They can use assessment for learning even with a large class. Yes,
Okay.
it can be used. Yes, definitely.
All right. And a question from Gary Mottram around evidence. Is there research evidence to show that in classrooms where assessment for learning is practiced, the learners are more successful than learners where it's not practiced?
Yes, there is research, and in the handout I've included some links and some references that you will find useful. There is particularly a study that Paul Black and Dylan William carried out in the University of London, and collecting results from research and putting them together in a booklet that is called Inside the Black Box. It's a kind of summary of existing research, and it's interesting. It's useful to have a first approximation to all this question of assessment for learning, and then there is lots of research. Yes.
Okay, great. A couple of questions. A couple of people asking about the mini fishbowl feedback. Could you just summarize that again for us?
Yes, of course. That is, you have pair work, or for example, two students doing some activity in pairs. And what you can do is you can appoint a third student to be the observer. So this, before you start the activity, you create a checklist with the students. Suppose if they have to discuss a certain topic, all right, so what do you want them to use? So with the class, you create a checklist with 4 or 5 items that students should bear in mind as they are doing the task. You give the checklist to the third student, to the observer. And as the two partners are working, this third student ticks or makes notes. Usually it's ticking because it's very, very easy to do. And when this observer notices the behaviors or the elements that are on the checklist, and then they can rotate. Then the observer can do the pair work with one of the other students, and then the third one in the group doing the observation.
Okay.
And this can be done also in groups when they are small group discussions, appointing one of the students to be the scribe or the observer.
Okay. And just kind of with that, because there's also another couple of questions about that, but in terms of the levels that you would kind of start this at, I mean, if you've got learners with a very kind of low level, they're just starting out, is this something that can work? Do you encourage? Yeah.
Yes, it can work, and I have sort of direct experience of this with my grandchildren. My granddaughter attends a school, an American school, and of course everything is in English. She is a Spanish speaker, well, Spanish and Portuguese speaker. She's bilingual. And my daughter told me how they work in the classrooms, and it's fantastic because they are 5 years old. The kids are 5 years old, and they do some activity, and then the teacher asks them what they think about what they did. If they are happy, if they are not very happy, if they can do it better. And it's incredible how these children can talk about what they have done. And if you are a parent and you talk to your children, you will see that from an early age, you can, I mean, I don't mean to say that when they are 2, you can do the same, because of course, they are too young. But when they are in kindergarten, for example, 5-year-olds, they know if what they have done is okay or not, if they are happy with what they have done, if they can make improvements. And if they don't have enough language, for example, with older students, if they don't have enough language to say what they want to say in English, allow them to use the first language. Because what we are encouraging here is reflection, not grammar.
Yeah, it's more that kind of soft skill. It's that skill of, and that's kind of what I was thinking actually around while I was listening to the talk, in terms of, I mean, there are various names from 21st century skills, core skills, whatever. This kind of learner training and this sort of the assessment for learning is, to me, feels like it's a very useful skill when we enter kind of the world of work, or the, you know, kind of leave education, and that kind of self-evaluation of I say performance, but, you know, how you're doing, and you know, if you can develop.
It's essential.
I
think it's essential, and we cannot expect an adult to have these skills from one day to the other if they had never done it before. I mean, I think it's better if we start training the students from an early age, so that also when they reach the higher levels of study or work, they can look back on what they have done and say, okay, I'm happy with this. I can improve this, and this is how I can improve it. Planning ahead, again, a metacognitive strategy. I'm very partial to metacognitive strategies myself. Yes.
Okay, just bring it back to one of the questions. It's from Nicole Zeng, and she says, concerning showing learning intentions at the beginning of a lesson, I'm wondering whether stages like predicting or skimming will be affected by showing students learning intentions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very important to tell them what they are going to learn. And how they are going to work with those learning intentions. For example, with skimming and scanning, tell them what that is about. Explain the words to them. Okay, skimming and scanning may seem 2 words that are not very learner friendly, and they are not, obviously. Students are not expected to understand what they are unless we explain. But when we are showing them what they are, the terms skimming and scanning can become part of their vocabulary. And in this way, when the next time we are working, trying to develop those skills, they will know how to name them. So that's also important, giving them the language, the meta language they need. Of course, respecting the question of age all the time.
Is it something, I mean, self-assessment, self-assessment particularly, perhaps rather than peer assessment, but where you have situations like, there's a question here from Orlando in Peru, where there are sort of 30 or 40 students and they only have a certain amount of time for assessment. Is it a valid homework task, the kind of the self-assessment of? Yes,
I would say so. Yes, because they have more time at home. If they have their checklist, for example, suppose that they have done a piece of writing, yes, okay, and they have a checklist that they have built in the classroom as a class, so they can take their checklist home and look back on their work and use the checklist to assess their own work. So little by little, they will become independent assessors of their own work.
Okay, understood. Thank you. All right, we've pretty much run out of time, so I'm just going to say a big thank you again, Annie. This has been really really fantastic and great to listen to you again.
Thank you, Paul.
And lots of fantastic comments as well in the chat.